August 6, 1945, 8:15 in the morning. The sky over western Japan is perfectly calm. On the radar screens of Japan's air defense network, three small signals appear. Three B-29 bombers flying at about 31,000 feet, moving steadily toward Hiroshima. No sirens sound, no fighters scramble. No one fires a single shot. Officers study the radar data, make a quick calculation, and deliver a decision that has been repeated for weeks. Not worth the fuel, because in their minds, three aircraft cannot threaten an entire city. But inside the bomb bay of the lead aircraft, a B-29 called Enola Gay is a weapon the world has never seen before. Within the next 40 minutes, Hiroshima will vanish, and the Japanese pilots standing under that quiet summer sky will live the rest of their lives with one question: why did they see the enemy and still never take off to stop it? To understand what truly happened that morning, we have to go back several years, to the moment Japan began losing control of the sky, long before the Enola Gay ever appeared. The morning of August 6, 1945 began like many others during the final summer of the Pacific War. The air was warm, the sky over western Japan was clear. Low clouds drifted slowly over the mountains of Honshu, and the rivers around Hiroshima reflected the pale blue light of early morning. Nothing about the day suggested that history was about to change. Across the region, military air bases were beginning their daily routines. Ground crews checked engines. Mechanics wiped oil from their hands. Pilots gathered in ready rooms, drinking thin coffee and waiting for assignments. Many of them already sensed the war was nearing its end. Japan had been fighting for nearly 4 years across the Pacific. Its cities had been bombed repeatedly. Its navy had been shattered. Its industrial capacity had been reduced to fragments. But despite all that, the war had not yet officially ended. And the Japanese military leadership still believed there would be one final battle. By the summer of 1945, Japan's strategy had narrowed to a single desperate idea. The United States would eventually attempt to invade the Japanese home islands. When that moment came, Japan would commit everything it had left. Every aircraft, every soldier, every remaining weapon. The goal was simple: inflict such devastating casualties on American forces that Washington would reconsider continuing the war. This strategy became known as Operation Katsugo. It was not just a plan, it became a doctrine repeated in briefings across the entire military. Fuel must be saved, aircraft must be preserved, pilots must be protected for the decisive battle. The assumption behind this doctrine was clear. The invasion had not happened yet. Therefore, Japan still had time. But behind the confident language of strategy briefings was a very different reality. Japan's air power had been slowly collapsing for years. At the beginning of the Pacific War, Japanese pilots were among the most skilled in the world. Aircraft like the Mitsubishi A6M0 had dominated early battles. In 1941 and 1942, Japanese fighters often outmaneuvered American aircraft. Experienced pilots gained reputations as elite warriors of the sky. But Japan had one critical weakness. Its pilot training system was slow. Training a skilled aviator required years of preparation, and once those experienced pilots were lost in combat, they were difficult to replace. The United States approached the problem differently. American industry and training programs expanded dramatically during the war. Thousands of new pilots were trained every year. Veteran pilots were rotated home to train the next generation. This meant experience was never entirely lost. Japan did the opposite. Veterans stayed in combat until they were killed. Their knowledge disappeared with them. Several battles during the war made the imbalance clear. In June 1942, during the Battle of Midway, Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers and many experienced pilots. It was a devastating blow. 2 years later, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the difference in pilot training and aircraft performance became impossible to ignore. American fighters shot down hundreds of Japanese aircraft in a single day. The battle became known among American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese aviation never fully recovered. After that point, Japan increasingly lost control of the skies. By late 1944, Japan's military leadership turned to a strategy born out of desperation: the kamikaze campaign. Pilots were ordered to deliberately crash their aircraft into American ships. The attacks caused real damage to the U.S. Navy. Several ships were sunk or heavily damaged. But the cost was enormous. Each kamikaze mission destroyed an aircraft and killed a trained pilot. For a country already suffering severe shortages of both, this was catastrophic. Japan was burning through its remaining air power faster than it could rebuild it. Even more critical than aircraft or pilots was fuel. Japan had relied heavily on oil imported from Southeast Asia. But by 1944, American submarines had effectively cut those supply lines. Tankers were sunk faster than they could be replaced. Refineries were bombed. Fuel reserves shrank month by month. By the summer of 1945, aviation fuel had become one of Japan's most precious resources. At some air bases, fuel was stored in small barrels rather than large tanks. Commanders counted every liter. Training flights were shortened. Combat patrols were limited. Fighters sometimes remained grounded for days, simply because there was no fuel available. This shortage shaped every decision made by Japan's air defense system. Japan did have radar installations spread across the home islands. They were not as sophisticated as the British system that defended London during the Battle of Britain, but they were functional. Radar operators could detect incoming aircrafts. They could estimate altitude and direction. Reports were sent to regional command centers. But the system had a major weakness. Detection did not guarantee response. Radar operators could see the enemy. But without fuel, without available aircraft, and without experienced pilots, interception was often impossible. The radar network could observe, it could report, but increasingly it could not act. During the final months of the war, American B-29 Superfortress bombers flew frequent missions over Japan. Many of these missions were large bombing raids, hundreds of aircraft dropping thousands of incendiary bombs. Entire sections of cities were burned to the ground. But other missions were smaller, sometimes just one or two aircraft. These were weather reconnaissance flights. Their purpose was simple. They flew ahead of bombing formations to determine which cities had clear skies. If the weather was favorable, the main bomber force would follow. These small reconnaissance flights rarely dropped bombs. They were considered low-priority targets. Scrambling fighters to intercept them often consumed more fuel than it was worth. As a result, many of these aircraft crossed Japanese airspace without opposition. This pattern had become routine. Shortly after 7 a.m. on August 6th, radar stations across southern Japan began detecting aircraft approaching from the Pacific. The signals were small, only 3 targets. Their altitude was unusually high, approximately 30,000 feet. Their speed was consistent with B-29 bombers. Operators logged the data and transmitted reports to regional air defense headquarters. 3 aircraft, high altitude, coursed toward western Honshu. To experienced officers reviewing the report, the conclusion seemed obvious. Another reconnaissance flight. At several command posts that morning, officers made the same calculation. Scrambling fighters would require precious fuel. The aircraft might not even reach the bombers in time. And if they did, there was no guarantee they could intercept them successfully at such high altitude. The B-29 had a major advantage. It could fly higher than many Japanese fighters could effectively operate. Chasing 3 aircraft might waste fuel needed later, fuel that was being saved for the invasion. So the order was simple: do not scramble interceptors. The aircraft were logged, their course noted, and the air defense network returned to routine observation. While radar operators recorded their movements, 3 American aircraft continued across the Japanese coastline. The lead aircraft was Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul W. Tibbets. Behind it flew the Great Artiste and Necessary Evil. They were not a normal bombing formation. Each aircraft had a specific role. Enola Gay carried the weapon. The other 2 aircraft carried scientific instruments and cameras. Their mission was not only military, it was also experimental. They were about to document the first use of a nuclear weapon in human history. The target city lay ahead. Hiroshima was an important military and logistical center. It served as headquarters for Japan's Second General Army. Troops were stationed there. Military supplies moved through its rail yards. Factories produced equipment for the war effort. But Hiroshima also had another characteristic that made it a unique target. Unlike many other Japanese cities, it had not been heavily bombed. Large areas of the city remained intact. For American planners, that made it ideal. If a new weapon was used here, its effects would be easier to measure. The damage would not be confused with earlier bombing. The results would be unmistakable. On the ground, life in Hiroshima continued normally. Workers traveled to factories. Students walked to school. Streetcars moved through the city center. The rivers flowed quietly through the urban districts. Some residents looked up and noticed faint contrails high in the sky. But that had become common. American aircraft had been seen frequently in recent weeks. Most people assumed it was another weather reconnaissance flight. There were no sirens, no panic, no warning. High above the city, Enola Gay continued its steady approach. Inside the bomb bay was a weapon unlike anything ever used before. But the decision that allowed it to reach Hiroshima had been made long before that morning. It had been made in factories producing aircraft, in shipyards launching carriers, in training schools producing thousands of pilots, and in strategic choices made years earlier. The sky over Japan on August 6th was quiet, not because American bombers were stealthy. It was quiet because Japan's air defense system no longer had the strength to challenge them. The 3 aircraft moving across that sky were not just bombers. They were the final proof that the balance of power in the Pacific had already shifted beyond recovery. And in less than an hour, the world would see the consequences. High above the Japanese coastline, the 3 aircraft continued their steady flight. At 31,000 feet, the air was thin and calm. The Pacific Ocean stretched behind them. Ahead lay the islands of Japan. Inside the cockpit of Enola Gay, the crew moved with quiet precision. They had trained for months for this mission. Every step had been rehearsed. Every calculation repeated again and again. But this morning was different. This time, the bomb in their aircraft was real. The B-29 Superfortress was one of the most advanced aircraft of the war. It was larger, faster, and capable of flying higher than most bombers used earlier in the conflict. Pressurized cabins allowed crews to operate at extreme altitudes. Powerful engines gave it long range, and heavy defensive armament protected it from enemy fighters. But Enola Gay was not a standard B-29. Several gun turrets had been removed. Armor plating had been reduced. The aircraft had been modified to carry a single, extremely heavy weapon. The goal was simple: reduce weight, fly higher, move faster, reach the target without interference. Inside the bomb bay rested a weapon officially designated Little Boy. It weighed roughly 4,400 kilograms. Its design was deceptively simple compared to later nuclear weapons. 2 masses of uranium would be forced together at high speed. When they combined, a chain reaction would begin. In less than a millionth of a second, enormous energy would be released. The explosive power was equivalent to approximately 15,000 tons of TNT. No one had ever used such a weapon in war. In fact, no one had ever seen its effects on a city. The scientists who helped design it had only calculations and test results from the desert of New Mexico. The mission over Hiroshima would be the first real demonstration. During the flight from Tinian Island, the bomb had not been fully armed. For safety, its internal components were assembled only after takeoff. This responsibility fell to Commander William Parsons, the naval officer responsible for the weapon. In the cramped bomb bay, Parsons carefully inserted the final explosive charge. It was dangerous work. Any mistake could have triggered a catastrophic accident, but the procedure went smoothly. Little Boy was now fully armed. As the aircraft crossed the Japanese coast, the crew scanned the sky. No fighters appeared. No anti-aircraft fire rose to meet them. The sky remained strangely quiet. Behind Enola Gay, the 2 observation aircraft maintained distance. The great Artiste carried instruments designed to measure blast pressure and radiation. Necessary Evil carried cameras that would record the explosion. The mission was not only military, it was scientific. Every moment of the detonation would be studied. Below them, the city of Hiroshima slowly came into view. From high altitude, the city appeared peaceful. The Otta River split into several branches, forming islands that held residential neighborhoods and industrial districts. Bridges connected the streets across the water. One of those bridges was especially distinctive. The Ioi Bridge, shaped like a T, stood near the center of the city. It had been selected as the aiming point. Its unusual shape made it easy to recognize from the air. Before the bombing run could begin, the crew needed confirmation that the city was visible. Cloud cover could force them to abort. But Hiroshima that morning was nearly cloudless. The sky was clear. Visibility was excellent. The crew of a separate weather reconnaissance aircraft had already transmitted confirmation. The conditions were ideal. There would be no need to switch to an alternate target. As the aircraft approached Hiroshima, the crew began the final bombing sequence. Bombardier Thomas Farabee moved to the Norden bomb site. The Norden device was one of the most sophisticated bombing instruments of the war. It calculated trajectory, speed, altitude, and wind. With it, a skilled bombardier could place a bomb with remarkable precision. Farabee adjusted the site carefully. He aligned the crosshairs with the city below. The aircraft stabilized. For a few seconds, everyone inside the plane focused on a single task. Hold the course. Maintain altitude. Stay steady. At 8:15 a.m., the bombing run reached its final seconds. Farabee watched the bridge move toward the center of his sight. The calculation completed. The release mechanism activated, and Little Boy fell from the bomb bay. The aircraft instantly became lighter. The bomb began its descent toward the city. The moment the bomb was released, Colonel Paul Tibbets initiated the escape maneuver. The aircraft banked sharply. A 155-degree turn carried the plane away from the blast zone. The crew had practiced this maneuver many times. They knew the explosion would produce a powerful shockwave. If the aircraft remained on its original course, the blast could destroy it. Speed and distance were the only protection. The bomb fell for 43 seconds. During that time, nothing on the ground appeared unusual. People continued walking through streets. Workers continued their routines. Streetcars continued moving across bridges. No sirens warned of danger. No one looked up in alarm. For the people of Hiroshima, the morning remained ordinary. At approximately 600 meters above the city, the bomb detonated. The explosion began with a flash. It was not simply bright, it was overwhelming. A burst of pure white light expanded outward faster than the eye could process. For a fraction of a second, the brightness rivaled the surface of the sun. Everything within range was illuminated. Shadows appeared instantly. Then the heat arrived. The first destructive force was not the shock wave. It was thermal radiation. An enormous wave of heat spread outward from the center of the explosion. Temperatures near the hypocenter reached thousands of degrees. Wood ignited instantly. Clothing caught fire. Human skin burned within seconds. Objects exposed directly to the flash absorbed intense energy. Stone surfaces were scorched. Metal warped. People close to the center simply vanished. Milliseconds later, the blast wave followed. Air pressure surged outward with incredible force. Buildings collapsed. Roofs lifted off structures. Walls shattered. Glass windows exploded across the city. The shock wave traveled faster than the speed of sound. Within seconds, it had flattened large sections of Hiroshima. Entire neighborhoods disappeared. After the blast came fire. Thousands of small fires ignited across the city. Wooden homes burned quickly. Paper walls and wooden beams fueled the flames. Fires merged together. Wind generated by the explosion fed the growing inferno. Soon the city was engulfed in a massive firestorm. From the air, the crew of Enola Gay saw the explosion grow beneath them. First came the flash, then a rising column of dust and smoke. Within seconds, the column climbed upward at astonishing speed. The crew watched in silence. Some described the sight as beautiful. Others described it as terrifying. A towering mushroom cloud formed as hot air rushed upward. It continued to grow. 10,000 feet, 20,000 feet, 30,000 feet. The cloud eventually rose higher than the aircraft itself. Approximately 40 seconds after the detonation, the shockwave reached the aircraft. The plane jolted violently. The crew briefly feared they had been hit by anti-aircraft fire, but the sky remained empty. There were no enemy fighters, no defensive fire, only the expanding cloud below. From high altitude, the city looked transformed. A massive column of smoke and fire marked the center of the blast. The edges of the city were obscured by dust and debris. Flames spread outward through the streets. The crew continued flying away from the explosion. None of them spoke for several moments. They were witnessing something humanity had never seen before. Meanwhile, across western Japan, radar stations continued monitoring the sky. Operators tracked the departing aircraft. But no interceptors had been launched. No attempt had been made to stop them. To the radar operators, the mission had appeared routine. 3 aircraft had entered Japanese airspace. 3 aircraft had left. The significance of the event had not yet been understood. Within minutes, communications lines around Hiroshima began failing. Radio stations went silent. Telephone lines stopped working. Nearby military units attempted to contact the city. No response came. From surrounding towns, witnesses reported a blinding flash. They described a powerful wind. Some saw a massive cloud rising above the horizon, but the full scale of the destruction remained unclear. Hours later, reconnaissance aircraft flew toward Hiroshima to investigate. What they saw stunned them. The center of the city was gone. Buildings had disappeared. Streets had vanished. Large sections of the urban landscape had become an empty field of debris and fire. The pilots reported what they could, but even their descriptions struggled to capture what had happened. The explosion over Hiroshima did more than destroy a city. It revealed a new reality. War had entered a different era. For centuries, the destruction of a city required armies. It required prolonged sieges or massive bombing campaigns involving hundreds of aircraft. But on that morning, a single aircraft had carried a weapon powerful enough to destroy an entire urban center. The implications were staggering. If one bomb could do this, what would happen if many more existed? For the Japanese pilots who watched the sky that morning, the realization would come slowly. At first, they only saw distant contrails. Then they saw a flash on the horizon. Later, they saw the towering cloud. And finally, they understood. The sky they had trained their entire lives to defend had already been lost. Not in a dogfight, not in a massive aerial battle, but in a quiet morning when 3 aircraft crossed the sky unchallenged. And in less than a minute, the world changed forever. For the people inside Hiroshima, the explosion did not feel like a bomb. It felt like the world had suddenly been replaced by light. Witnesses later described the first moment as a flash so bright that it erased every shadow. It lasted only an instant. But in that instant, the city changed forever. The explosion began with an intense burst of radiation. A sphere of fire formed in the air, roughly 600 meters above the city. Within fractions of a second, temperatures inside that sphere reached several million degrees. The heat spread outward faster than any natural fire. Surfaces facing the blast absorbed enormous energy. Stone darkened. Roof tiles cracked. Wood ignited. Human skin burned instantly. People close to the center of the explosion were exposed to temperatures no human body could survive. Many disappeared before they could even react. One of the strangest things discovered later was the presence of permanent shadows. The intense flash of radiation bleached surfaces such as stone steps, walls, and pavement. But where a person or object blocked the light, the surface remained darker. The result was a silhouette. A human outline burned permanently into stone. In some places, the shape of a person sitting on steps could still be seen. The body was gone, but the shadow remained. It was a silent record of the moment the light passed through the city. Less than a second after the flash, the blast wave arrived. The explosion compressed the surrounding air into a massive wall of pressure. This wall moved outward at incredible speed. Buildings near the center collapsed instantly. Walls shattered. Roofs lifted off structures and flew into the streets. Glass windows exploded into thousands of razor-sharp fragments. People caught outdoors were thrown to the ground. Others were crushed beneath collapsing structures. Within a radius of nearly 2 kilometers, the city was devastated. Entire neighborhoods disappeared in seconds. The blast itself destroyed many buildings. But the fires that followed caused even greater destruction. The heat from the explosion ignited thousands of small fires at once. Hiroshima was a city built largely of wood. Traditional houses used wooden beams and paper walls. These materials burned quickly. Flames spread through streets and alleyways. The fires merged together, forming a massive firestorm. Air rushed toward the center of the flames. Strong winds fed the inferno. Anything still standing soon caught fire. In the streets, survivors began to move. Many were badly burned. Their clothing had caught fire. Their skin was blistered and peeling. Some people walked silently through the smoke. Others collapsed after only a few steps. Witnesses later described seeing people with skin hanging from their arms. Many held their arms out in front of them to reduce the pain. Few people screamed. Many were simply too shocked. The destruction around them was beyond comprehension. Hiroshima was surrounded by rivers. As fires spread across the city, thousands of people moved toward the water. They believed the river would protect them from the flames. Many jumped into the water. Some were too weak to swim. Others were already dying from burns. The riverbanks quickly filled with injured people. Some tried to drink the water. Some simply lay down along the shore. The rivers became crowded with bodies. In most cities, medical services respond quickly after a bombing. But Hiroshima had lost much of its medical capacity in the first seconds. Several major hospitals were located near the center of the city. These buildings were destroyed almost immediately. Doctors and nurses were killed along with their patients. Other medical facilities were heavily damaged. Equipment was buried under debris. Electric power was gone. Water systems were broken. Even where doctors survived, they had almost nothing to work with. Bandages ran out quickly. Medicines were scarce. Thousands of wounded people had no treatment. As the fires spread, communication across Hiroshima stopped completely. Telephone lines had been destroyed. Radio transmitters were damaged. Military headquarters could no longer send reports. To outside observers, the city simply disappeared from the communication network. Nearby towns tried to contact Hiroshima. There was no answer. At first, commanders assumed a conventional bombing raid had taken place, but something about the silence felt wrong. Even after heavy bombing, some communication usually survived. This time, nothing did. Above the city, the mushroom cloud continued to grow. The explosion had forced superheated air upward with tremendous force. Dust, smoke, and debris followed. The cloud expanded as it climbed. Its base darkened. Its top spread outward. Within minutes, it reached altitudes far above the surrounding mountains. Observers many kilometers away could see the cloud rising. Some thought it was a massive industrial explosion. Others believed a large ammunition depot had detonated. No one imagined that a single bomb had caused it. Several hours after the explosion, the sky above Hiroshima changed again. Dark clouds formed above the burning city. Soon a strange rain began to fall. The droplets were thick and dark. They carried soot, ash, and radioactive particles lifted into the atmosphere by the explosion. This phenomenon later became known as black rain. Many survivors were desperate for water. Their throats burned from heat and smoke. Some opened their mouths and drank the rain. They did not know it carried radioactive contamination. Later that morning, Japanese military command ordered reconnaissance flights toward Hiroshima. And pilots approaching the city struggled to understand what they were seeing. Normally, after a bombing raid, sections of a city remain visible. Blocks of buildings might burn while other areas remain intact. Road networks and rivers still provide orientation. But Hiroshima looked different. Large sections of the city had vanished. Buildings had not simply burned, they had been flattened. The familiar layout of streets was gone. Smoke and dust covered the landscape. One pilot reportedly radioed back a message that confused everyone listening. He said simply, "The city appears to be gone." By midday, the scale of the disaster began to emerge. Military officers attempted to estimate damage based on aerial observations. Entire districts had disappeared. Bridges were damaged. Factories were destroyed. But the most alarming detail was the pattern of destruction. The damage radiated outward from a single point. It was not scattered across multiple locations as in conventional bombing. This suggested something entirely different had happened. The officers reviewing the reports began considering possibilities. Perhaps a new type of bomb had been used, but none of them yet understood how powerful it was. Inside the city, survivors continued to move away from the center of destruction. Many walked for hours. Their clothes were burned, their faces covered in ash. Some people held pieces of cloth over their mouths to filter smoke. Others carried injured family members. Many searched desperately for relatives. Parents looked for children. Children searched for parents. But in many cases, the people they were looking for no longer existed. In the hours after the explosion, another invisible threat began to appear. People who seemed uninjured began to feel ill. They experienced nausea. Some vomited repeatedly. Others developed severe headaches. At the time, doctors did not understand why. There were few visible wounds, but the symptoms grew worse. Hair began to fall out. Skin darkened. Weakness spread through the body. The cause was radiation exposure. But in August 1945, very few people understood how radiation affected the human body. For many victims, the illness would take days or weeks to reveal its full impact. By the afternoon of August 6, Japanese military command finally understood that Hiroshima had suffered an unprecedented disaster, but the cause remained unclear. Reports described a single explosion, but the scale of destruction suggested something far greater. Several officers proposed a troubling possibility. The United States might have developed a new kind of weapon, a weapon far more powerful than conventional explosives. The idea seemed almost impossible, but the evidence pointed in that direction. Later that day, a radio broadcast from the United States confirmed their fears. President Harry Truman announced that America had used an atomic bomb. He warned that if Japan did not surrender, more bombs could follow. For the first time, Japanese leaders understood what had happened. Hiroshima had not been destroyed by hundreds of aircraft. It had been destroyed by one bomb. The news shocked military planners. Japan had prepared for invasion. They had prepared for massive bombing raids. But they had not prepared for a weapon capable of destroying an entire city in seconds. If America possessed several of these weapons, the strategic balance of the war had changed completely. The country had no defense against them. No fighter aircraft could intercept such a weapon once it was dropped. No anti-aircraft guns could stop it. Once the bomb left the aircraft, nothing could prevent the explosion. Hiroshima represented more than a military disaster. It marked the end of an era. For centuries, wars had been fought with armies and fleets. Victory depended on industrial production, troop movements, and battlefield tactics. But the atomic bomb introduced something entirely new. A weapon capable of destroying an entire city in seconds. A weapon powerful enough to make traditional defenses irrelevant. On that morning in August, the nature of war changed, and the people of Hiroshima experienced the first moment of that new reality. Night fell over the ruins of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. But darkness did not bring silence. Fires still burned across the city. Entire districts glowed red in the distance. Columns of smoke drifted upward into the evening sky. Where streets had once been filled with people and traffic, there were now only scattered figures moving slowly through the wreckage. Some searched for family, some searched for water. Some simply wandered without direction. Many did not yet understand what had happened to them. In most bombed cities, landmarks remain. A cathedral, a railway station, a government building, something that tells survivors where they are. In Hiroshima, those landmarks were gone. The center of the city had been erased. Buildings had not simply collapsed. They had been crushed, burned, and scattered across the ground. The familiar geography of the city had vanished. People who tried to navigate through the ruins often became lost within their own neighborhoods. Entire blocks no longer existed. As night deepened, thousands of survivors gathered along the riverbanks. They lay on the ground or leaned against broken walls. Some were burned so badly that they could not move. Others tried to help strangers. Improvised shelters were created from pieces of debris. There were no organized rescue operations. Most emergency services had been destroyed in the explosion. Doctors who survived tried to treat the wounded, but they had almost nothing. No medicine, no equipment, no electricity. For many victims, the first night passed without treatment. Far away in Tokyo, military leaders struggled to understand the disaster. Reports arrived slowly and often contradicted each other. Some described a massive explosion. Others reported fires covering large areas of the city. But the most puzzling detail was always the same. Radar had detected only 3 aircraft. 3 bombers could not destroy a city. Even the largest conventional bombing raids required hundreds of planes. The scale of destruction described in the report seemed impossible. For several hours, the leadership simply did not know what had happened. Later that day, the mystery was solved. A radio broadcast from the United States reached Japan. President Harry S. Truman announced that America had used a new weapon, an atomic bomb. He described it as a weapon that released the energy of the atom itself. And he warned that more bombs could follow if Japan continued fighting. The message was clear. Hiroshima was not an accident. It was the beginning of something new. Within Japan's leadership, the announcement created shock and confusion. Some officials immediately understood the implications. Others refused to believe it. The idea that a single bomb could destroy an entire city seemed impossible. Japan had studied nuclear research before the war, but its scientists had concluded that producing such a weapon would require enormous industrial resources. They believed it would take years, perhaps decades. Yet now a city lay in ruins, and the United States claimed to possess more bombs like it. For 3 days after the destruction of Hiroshima, Japan's leadership debated its next move. The government was deeply divided. Some military leaders insisted that the war must continue. They believed that Japan could still inflict enormous casualties if American forces invaded the home islands. They argued that a bloody invasion might force the United States to negotiate peace. Others believed that the situation had changed completely. If America truly possessed atomic weapons, then Japan faced a threat unlike anything before. Cities could disappear in seconds. No defense existed against such attacks. Before Japan reached a decision, another American aircraft was already on its way. On the morning of August 9th, a B-29 bomber named Boxcar took off from Tinian Island. Its mission was similar to that of Enola Gay. It carried the second atomic bomb. This weapon was different from the one used at Hiroshima. It used a more complex design involving plutonium. The bomb was known as Fat Man. Its explosive power was even greater than Little Boy. The original target that morning was the city of Kokura. But when the aircraft reached the area, thick clouds covered the city. Bombing rules required visual confirmation of the target. The crew circled several times, hoping the clouds would clear. But fuel was running low. Finally, the mission commander ordered the aircraft to proceed to the secondary target. Nagasaki. At 11:02 a.m., the bomb over Nagasaki detonated. The explosion created another blinding flash. Another massive mushroom cloud rose into the sky. Thousands of people were killed instantly. Entire sections of the city were destroyed. The terrain of Nagasaki limited some of the damage. But the message was unmistakable. The United States did not possess just one atomic bomb. It had at least two, and perhaps many more. On the same day as the Nagasaki bombing, another shock struck Japan. The Soviet Union declared war. For months, Japan had hoped that Moscow might help negotiate peace with the United States. Now that possibility disappeared. Soviet forces launched a massive invasion into Manchuria, attacking Japanese armies stationed there. The offensive was overwhelming. Japanese defenses collapsed quickly. For the first time, Japan faced the prospect of invasion from two directions, from the United States in the Pacific, and from the Soviet Union in Asia. The situation forced Japan's leadership into a critical meeting. Senior members of the government gathered in Tokyo. This meeting became known as the Imperial Conference. The room included political leaders, military commanders, and advisors. The debate lasted for hours. Some generals argued that Japan should continue fighting. They believed surrender would dishonor the nation. Others believed further resistance would only bring more destruction. 2 cities had already been destroyed. More could follow. At last, a decision required the intervention of someone who rarely spoke in such meetings. Emperor Hirohito. In Japanese tradition, the emperor rarely intervened directly in military decisions. But the war had reached a moment beyond tradition. Hirohito listened carefully to both sides. Then he spoke. He said that continuing the war would bring only further suffering to the Japanese people. He said that Japan must endure the unendurable. And he ordered the government to accept the terms of surrender. On August 15, 1945, millions of Japanese citizens gathered around radios. They had been told that an important announcement would be made. Few of them had ever heard the emperor's voice. And traditionally, the emperor communicated through written proclamations, but this time was different. At noon, the radio broadcast began. The emperor spoke in formal language. His words were careful and indirect, but the meaning was unmistakable. Japan had accepted surrender. The war was over. Across the country, reactions varied. Some people wept openly. Others sat in stunned silence. Soldiers who had prepared for years to defend their homeland struggled to accept the news. In air bases across Japan, pilots gathered in ready rooms. Some stared at the aircraft they had flown for years. Machines that once represented national pride now seemed useless. There would be no final battle. No heroic last stand. The war had ended not with a dramatic clash of armies, but with a voice on the radio. In the years after the war, many Japanese pilots reflected on the events of August 1945. Some remembered seeing the contrails of American aircraft in the sky. Some remembered the flash on the horizon. Many realized that the decisive moment had come long before Hiroshima. It had come gradually, with each lost pilot, with each destroyed aircraft carrier, with each factory bombed. By the summer of 1945, the outcome of the war had already been determined. The atomic bomb only revealed that reality. Before Hiroshima, the sky had been a battlefield. Fighter pilots fought duels at high altitude. Bombers ran gauntlets of anti-aircraft fire. Victory belonged to the side with the better pilots and the stronger industry. But after Hiroshima, the sky changed. It became the delivery path for weapons capable of destroying entire cities. The traditional rules of air warfare no longer applied. Historians often describe Hiroshima as the moment when the world entered the nuclear age. For the first time, humanity possessed a weapon capable of destroying civilization itself. Nations would spend the following decades trying to control that power, trying to prevent another Hiroshima. But the lesson of that morning remained. Scientific discovery had changed the nature of war. Years later, survivors and pilots alike remembered the same image. 3 contrails stretching across a quiet morning sky. They looked ordinary, like the trails of many aircraft before them. But those lines marked a turning point in human history. They marked the moment when a new kind of weapon crossed the sky, and when one city in a single flash of light became the first victim of the atomic age.